The announcement crackled through the training yard loudspeaker, slicing through morning drills like a gunshot. Every cadet turned. Grace Walker stood frozen in line, her name echoing a second time, louder now like a verdict. A uniformed officer approached, expression blank, envelope in hand. No explanation, no review, just a single command. You're dismissed. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Someone scoffed. Someone else chuckled under their breath. Guess the girl from the wheat fields couldn't fly with the real ones. Grace didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She took the envelope, nodded once, and walked away, boots steady on concrete that suddenly felt like judgment. No one noticed the old wing pin hidden inside her jacket. No one knew her father had once worn it until the Air Force buried his career in a quiet scandal and never looked back. But Grace wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Stay with us until the end, because what happens next will leave you breathless. And if you believe talent deserves a voice, no matter where it comes, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what Grace does next. Grace Walker hadn't come from pedigree. There were no stars in her bloodline, no generals in her family tree, no framed photographs of great-grandfathers in uniforms lining the walls of her childhood home. What she had was farmland, endless, sun-drenched Kansas farmland, and a father who taught her how to fly before she ever learned to drive. While other kids grew up with bedtime stories, Grace fell asleep to the hum of aircraft engines outside her window. Her father, John Walker, once a military test pilot, had turned to crop dusting after a mysterious incident forced him out of the service. He never spoke about it. But the scar on his left shoulder and the bitterness in his silences spoke louder than any report. He built a makeshift airstrip behind their barn. That's where Grace took her first solo flight, barely tall enough to reach the pedals, gripping the stick like it was part of her own heartbeat. "Feel it, Grace," he'd say, kneeling beside her in the dust. "Don't just fly the plane, let it fly with you." By 16, she could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. By 18, she'd navigated tornadic winds during a regional flight challenge and placed first, beating out commercial pilots twice her age. Her skill wasn't theoretical, it was survival. Precision flying over cornrows and telephone lines, dodging power poles and migrating geese. But the academy didn't measure instinct. They measured protocol. From the moment she stepped onto the concrete grounds of the Air Force Flight Initiative, she was the outsider. Older than most recruits at 29, less polished, less connected, more mechanic than officer. Her uniform fit but never quite the way theirs did. And though she scored high in mechanical aptitude and reflex simulations, her flight evaluation scores never matched up. Small anomalies, persistent calibration errors enough to place her just below the threshold. Always just below. She didn't complain. She didn't have the luxury. And she wasn't there to make friends. But they noticed those cadets born of legacy and rank. They noticed her silence, her calloused hands, the way she fixed her own gear without asking, and they mocked it. "Walker, the wrench queen. Sure, she can fix a plane, but can she fly one?" Captain Thornton noticed too. His perfectly shined shoes, calculated manner, and carefully masked disdain told her everything. He didn't believe she belonged, not because of her skill, but because she didn't come from the right blood. What none of them realized was that Grace hadn't come to impress anyone. She came to keep a promise to the man who taught her to fly, and who never got his chance to clear his name. 2 days after her dismissal, Grace was packing the last of her things when she found it tucked between an old maintenance log and a flight manual in her locker. A folded note with her name scrawled in oil, black ink. "Haven't forgotten what they did to your father. Meet me behind Hangar 3 after taps. C." She knew exactly who it was. Carl Simmons had been around forever, the Academy's lead mechanic, with a limp in his step and oil-stained hands that looked more machine than man. While most instructors barely acknowledged her existence, Carl had always nodded at her, like they were in on the same secret. He rarely spoke unless it was about aircraft and, even then, it was more philosophy than instruction. "Airplanes are like people," he once told her. "You treat them like a checklist, they'll fail you. You listen, They'll tell you everything. That night, under the low hum of the floodlights and the smell of hot tarmac, Carl waited beside a tool cart, his arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You're leaving," he said flatly. "I was told to." "You shouldn't have been." Grace said nothing. She'd already grieved the injustice, packed it away with her gear. But Carl wasn't done. "Your father John, he wasn't grounded because of error." He was silenced. The words hit her like turbulence. Carl pulled out a thin folder, weathered, edges curled from time. "This is what they buried," he said. He flagged a critical fault in the control system of a prototype. Thornton signed off on it anyway. They called it pilot error when it failed. But John had documented everything. Grace stared at the file, disbelief turning slowly into something sharper. "But why now?" she asked. "Why give this to me now?" "Because I saw your last sim session. You flew the F-18 like it was in your bones, and yet they said you failed stress response." They always had a reason. Calibration off. Sensors misaligned. "Exactly," Carl snapped. "Someone made sure your scores would always fall short. Thornton doesn't just fear incompetence. He fears being outshone, especially by a walker." Her father's name suddenly felt like a weight she'd been carrying unknowingly her whole life. Carl reached into the cart and pulled out a small keycard. "You've got 2 hours before the demonstration. There's a new F-22 prototype parked in maintenance top of the line. Thornton's scheduled to fly it in front of Pentagon brass. But it's not on full lock yet. You want to prove you belong? Fly it. Quietly. Before they take even that away." Grace stared at the keycard in his palm. One step, and she'd be committing career suicide. Or maybe for the first time taking control of her own story. She took the key. Carl didn't smile, but there was something like pride in his eyes. Show them what the name Walker really means. The hangar looked empty from the outside, just another aluminum skeleton under a midnight sky. But inside, beneath a half-draped tarp and the quiet drone of cooling fans, sat the FX-22, sleek, coiled, and silent, like a predator waiting for prey that hadn't yet arrived. Grace hesitated at the threshold. The access key Carl had given her buzzed in her hand, its weight amplified by the risk it represented. One wrong move, one misplaced sensor log, and this wouldn't just be the end of her flight career. It would be the end of everything. She stepped in. The air smelled like metal, heat, and possibility. The Raptor loomed ahead, its matte surface gleaming under the dim emergency lights. Grace circled it slowly, reverently, like a diver rediscovering a sunken temple. She traced her fingers along the cold fuselage. The designation number was stenciled just beneath the canopy. FX-22, call sign, Coleman. Her heart stopped. That was her father's call sign. She reached up, hand trembling slightly, and touched the marking. A quiet fury stirred inside her. This wasn't just a coincidence. Thornton had requested this aircraft, chosen this model, this name, knowing exactly what it meant. This flight wasn't just for performance, it was for dominance, to erase the name Walker from the sky for good. Not tonight. Grace climbed the ladder into the cockpit, her boots silent against the rungs. The interior wrapped around her like a second skin. Digital readouts flickered to life, casting soft blue light across her face. She inhaled sharply. This wasn't like her father's old biplane. This was evolution, but it still spoke the same language. Her fingers danced over the controls, instinctive, precise, fluid. She moved through the startup checklist, skipping the obvious, feeling for the plane's rhythm instead of obeying its instructions. Within moments, the simulator interface booted up holographic overlays, projecting test parameters into her field of vision. No guidance, no assistance, just her and the machine. She ran the first sequence: controlled ascent, stall recovery, descent loop, clean. Second run: inverted roll, wind shear response, manual override of auto stabilizers. One hiccup. She corrected mid-spin. By the third round, she was gliding through the motions, the FX-22 responding not to her commands, but to her intent. That's when she heard the footsteps. She froze. A shadow moved just outside the hangar's open side door. A figure stepped in, broad shoulders, pressed uniform, jaw clenched in tension. Grace's muscles coiled, ready to flee until the voice called softly, "Relax. If I was going to report you, I'd already have done it." It was Jonas Reed, a cadet known more for his arrogance than his alliances. He folded his arms, eyes scanning the cockpit's display with thinly veiled astonishment. "I watched your last sim. You flew circles around half our instructors. So why are your scores tanking?" Grace held his gaze. "Maybe because someone's making sure they do." He paused. "Then maybe it's time someone else starts watching your six." For the next 2 nights, the hangar became their sanctuary. Grace flew in silence, her movements crisp and instinctual, while Jonas watched from the side like a student too proud to admit he was learning. He brought her flight manuals she didn't need, energy bars she didn't ask for, and slowly, without a word exchanged about trust, he became part of the mission. During the day, she was a ghost on base, packing up her belongings, offering short nods to cadets who avoided eye contact. She didn't fight the whispers, let them think she was gone. But when the sun dipped low and the base lights turned cold, she returned to the simulator. She ran combat sequences meant for elite trainees, tackled emergency drills with deliberately flawed input codes, and tested recovery protocols under the most brutal virtual conditions. Every run pushed her further. Every failure became fuel. Jonas would debrief her after each session, tracking patterns, helping her refine split-second decisions. What started as rivalry slowly melted into rhythm. For the first time since entering the academy, Grace didn't feel alone in the air. It was Jonas who uncovered the most damning piece of truth. "Thornton's been logging into the system under proxy credentials," he said one night, holding up a flash drive. "I cross-referenced metadata from your failed evaluations. They were altered after hours tampered with, just enough to disqualify." Grace stared at him. "You're sure?" He nodded grimly. "I confronted him once. He said you were a threat to the Academy's image. Said if they let someone like you pass, the program would lose credibility." "Someone like me?" Grace echoed. Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to. That same night, Carl returned with news that froze the air in her lungs. "Thornton requested the Coleman specifically for the demonstration," he said, voice tight with rage. "He's flying it to honor your father," he claimed, called it poetic justice. Grace looked at the call sign painted on the FX-22's side, the same one her father had once worn with pride. That name wasn't Thornton's to use. It had already been stained once. She wouldn't let him desecrate it again. The plan began to take form. They would let him think everything was under control. Let him tweak the aircraft, optimize it to his preferences. But Carl would document every change. Then, just before the demonstration, he'd restore the Coleman settings to factory default, nullifying every underhanded adjustment Thornton had made. Grace's role was simple: fly. Not to show off, not to humiliate, but to prove undeniably that she belonged. Jonas handed her a security badge. "You'll have 6 minutes to get from the maintenance corridor to the hangar bay. After that, you're on your own." Grace took it without hesitation. The girl they'd dismissed had become the woman they hadn't seen coming. And now, the sky they'd tried to keep from her was about to become her stage. The morning of the demonstration dawned with razor-blue skies-perfect flying weather. The airfield buzzed with movement, crews checking aircraft, officers reviewing protocol, high-ranking officials arriving under tight security. In the middle of it all, Captain Max Thornton stood beside the Coleman, looking like a man rehearsing victory. Grace watched from a narrow maintenance corridor, helmet tucked under one arm, hair pinned tight beneath her cap. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not with fear, but with calculation. Everything had led to this. Carl's voice buzzed in her earpiece. "He just finished pre-check. All his customizations are in boosted throttle response, reduced yaw damping, just enough edge to shine without raising alarms. I've restored factory settings. The bird's clean." "Copy that," Grace whispered. standing by. At 1,400 hours, Thornton launched. The Coleman roared down the runway, slicing into the sky like a silver blade. Grace watched him execute the opening sequence flawlessly, loops, banking turns, a high G climb that drew polite applause from the VIPs on the viewing platform. But she wasn't clapping. She moved. Slipping past a distracted junior officer, Grace crossed the tarmac in a calculated sprint toward the standby Raptor FX-93, parked at the far end of the lot. No one stopped her. Jonas had predicted the timing with near-surgical precision. Shift change, overlapping patrols, one blind spot in the tower's system. She climbed into the cockpit, sealed the hatch, and powered up. The system responded instantly. Carl had left it primed. Tower. This is FX-93, requesting emergency takeoff clearance, she transmitted. Confusion crackled back. FX-93, there's no emergency flight scheduled. Identify yourself and authorization code. Grace Walker, call sign Sparrow. Authorization Coleman 739er. A long pause. Then, just as she reached for the throttle to abort, Carl's final gift surged through the tower, a wave of interference that short-circuited communications just long enough to trigger the emergency override. FX-93, you are cleared for emergency takeoff on runway 3. She took it. The Raptor screamed down the runway and lifted into the air, cutting through the clouds like it was born to belong there. High above, Thornton was midway through his signature maneuver, an inverted descent followed by a tight corkscrew spin. Then his radio crackled. Unscheduled aircraft entering airspace. A voice barked. Confirm identity. Grace's presence hit the radar like a thunderclap. Thornton broke formation in fury. Who the hell? Then he saw her. Grace pulled alongside, flying wing to wing with the Coleman. Through the glass of their cockpits, their eyes locked, his disbelief morphing into rage. She raised one hand and tapped the insignia pinned over her heart. Walker. He knew. She pulled ahead, breaking formation and rolling upward into the vertical climb he'd just failed to execute cleanly. Her movements were fluid, natural, more dance than drill. The crowd below stirred, heads turning, murmurs rippling like wind through wheat. FX-93, identify and state purpose, came the tower again, more insistent now. This is Lieutenant Candidate Grace Walker. I am completing the demonstration Captain Thornton failed to finish, she said calmly, and I'd like to dedicate this flight to my father, John Walker. The line went silent. Then a new voice cut through, deep, authoritative. This is General Michaels, Pentagon Oversight. Permission granted. Show us what you've got, Sparrow. And she did. For the next 5 minutes, Grace moved the F-22 through a sequence that hadn't been in any manual. Compound turns, near impossible climbs, an inverted dive that leveled out just 20 feet above the runway, before she shot back into the sky like lightning reborn. Down below, Thornton was struggling. Carl's resets had thrown off his rhythm. He overcompensated, and the Coleman dipped into a destabilizing spin. Grace saw it on radar. A part of her wanted to let him falter, let him feel what her father had felt when his reputation was stripped away. But she didn't. Coleman, she transmitted, reduce throttle by 40%. Ease stick 2 degrees port. You're fighting factory settings, not your mods. A long pause. Then, the spin corrected. Thornton steadied. She didn't wait for thanks. Grace peeled away and climbed one final time into the sun, into the space where her name had never been welcome. Until now, the applause was thunderous. Not polite, not procedural. Real. Grace couldn't hear it through the canopy, but she saw the faces as she touched, down, astonished, speechless, standing. She taxied the Raptor to a halt, powered down the engines, and sat in silence for a moment, hands still on the controls, heart racing with the aftershock of everything she had just done. No one escorted her off the runway. Instead, a group approached from the far end of the field, General Harlan Michaels at the front, flanked by senior officers, some of whom had reviewed and signed her dismissal less than a week ago. Walker, the general said when she stepped out. His voice was level, but something in his eyes glinted with unexpected warmth. "You caused quite a stir today." Grace met his gaze. "I imagine I did, sir. I also imagine you have an explanation. Fortunately for both of us," he added, "you don't need to give it to me alone." In the briefing room, the walls felt closer than the sky. A projector hummed to life. On the screen, thermal footage, security logs, tampered data from flight systems meticulously gathered by Carl and Jonas over the past 72 hours. Captain Thornton sat stone-faced at the far end of the table. His jaw flexed with every damning revelation. "You authorized software alterations to cadet simulators," one official said. "You requested private access to the Coleman multiple times without oversight," another added. "And," General Michaels concluded, "you intentionally selected the call sign of a pilot whose career you helped destroy." Thornton didn't answer. Then Jonas stood. "He told me Grace was a threat to the program's prestige," the cadet admitted, his voice low but steady. "Said she'd never be accepted because she didn't come from the right lineage." Silence. Lieutenant Flores entered the room at that moment, placing a tablet before the general. "Sir, our independent investigation confirms a 5-year pattern of score tampering. 28 cadets, most from underrepresented backgrounds, were either pushed out or buried beneath false metrics. Grace Walker was simply the one who refused to disappear quietly." The general leaned back. "Captain Thornton, you are hereby relieved of command, pending formal charges." Thornton stood abruptly, eyes flashing with something between panic and pride. This woman broke protocol. She stole government property. She endangered a demonstration. "She saved it," General Michaels interrupted. "She saved you." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. Later that evening, in a smaller, quieter room, the general handed her a velvet box. "Your father, John Walker, was posthumously exonerated last year. His record has been restored. I'd planned to mail this." He opened the box. Inside, a medal distinguished service, shining, untouched by the dust of false reports. "But I think he would have wanted you to accept it in person." Grace's hand trembled as she took it. This wasn't just for her. This was for every name they had tried to erase, and every voice that finally refused to stay silent. 6 months later, the airfield looked different. The hangars were freshly painted, the cadet evaluations restructured under new protocols, and the old hierarchy built on legacy and silent biashad begun to fracture. Not overnight, not completely, but it was a start. Grace stood on the same stretch of tarmac where they'd once called her name just to humiliate her. Today, they called it for a different reason. "Lieutenant Grace Walker," came the announcer's voice over the speakers, steady and proud. She stepped forward in uniform. Real bars now adorned her collar knot, honorary, not symbolic, earned. She carried herself with quiet certainty, every step an answer to the doubt that had once echoed louder than her name. Carl was there, leaning against a toolbox, arms crossed. Jonas stood nearby in full dress, newly promoted and already making good on his promise to reform from within. And Floresno, head of cadet oversight, watched from the control tower, arms folded, eyes fierce with respect. But it was the sky Grace was focused on. The Coleman waited on the runway, her father's call sign still gleaming on the side, not as a reminder of disgrace, but as a banner reclaimed. She climbed into the cockpit alone. No simulator. No second chances. Just flight. As the jet lifted off, rising into the gold-pink light of morning, Grace felt it not just adrenaline, not just pride. Freedom. Above the clouds, she pushed the aircraft into a tight spiral, the sun catching the wing like a silver flame. Below her, the gathered dignitaries, cadets, and commanders tilted their heads skyward. But Grace didn't perform for them. She flew for herself, for her father, for every cadet who had ever been told they didn't belong. The Coleman responded as if it understood, graceful, balanced, alive. It wasn't a machine anymore. It was memory and justice and a legacy reborn in motion. As she arced into her final maneuver, a slow roll that unfolded like a ribbon across the sky, Grace whispered into the headset, "This is for you, Dad." And far above the field where her journey had once been grounded, Grace Walker soared no longer the girl from the wheat fields, but the woman who'd rewritten what it meant to fly. They never apologized, not formally. There were no ceremonies held in her name, no press releases about the wrongs set right. The institution, like many, preferred to move forward without looking back too long. But that was fine. Grace Walker didn't need headlines. Her vindication lived in the silence after she landed, when even the loudest doubters found nothing left to say. It lived in the mentorship program Flores launched in her name. In the new cadets, wide-eyed and uncertain, who now saw someone like her not as an outlier, but as a path. It lived in how she carried herself each morning on the flight linen, not demanding respect, but commanding it through presence alone. And it lived, most of all, in the box on her shelf. A velvet case. Inside, a tarnished pilot's pin and a gleaming medal side by side. One earned in quiet, the other restored in light. Sometimes at night, Grace would run her thumb along the old pin's smooth edges where her father's name had once been etched and worn away, but she no longer needed to read it to know it was there. It was in her bones, in her breath, in her wings. They'd tried to ground her with silence, with manipulation, with legacy walls she was never meant to climb. But Grace didn't need permission to fly. She just needed sky. And now that she had it, she was never coming down.